Okay, so today we are on Samach Beis Amud Aleph. Samach Beis Amud Aleph. We're going to continue where we left off last week, and the discussion surrounded the question of the machlokes between Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yochanan, whether or not one has to return uh, to the rightful owner ribis. So we talked about the difference in ribis ketsutza, which is actual ribis midaraisa, which we talked about is like money in a loan because it's established, and that's what it is. And something called avak ribis, which is ribis, which we have discussed about ribis in business, where you started normal and then it turned out to be ribis because something appreciated in price, and when you got it back, it was worth more than when you gave it. So the avak ribis is only midrabanan, but you can see where someone might treat it much lightly, more lightly than actual ribis. Because when you have ribis and I lend you $100 and I want 110 back, that screams ribis. But in the course of business, which maybe all of us were involved at some point in time, it's hard to determine sometimes when you do business and you wind up, there's an appreciation in the marketplace. And of course, we know there was exceptions, which the Gemara told us about in the very beginning. If you acquire the whole thing, but you leave it by the seller so that he should hold on to it, and then it appreciates. So we find a loophole that the appreciation was yours, even though you didn't take it. But stamazai, how do it's hard to reconcile, which is why midoraisa there's no ribbis. But in the machlokes between Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Lezer said very clearly that ribbis ketzutza has to be returned. I mean, in other words, Besdin can adjudicate and has to be returned. Avak ribis, no. That's not something that Besdin can adjudicate, and therefore, technically, you don't have to return it. Now, there's always a moral obligation, but that's separate and apart from what the halach is. Comes Rabbi Yochanan, and he says you never have to return it. What do you mean return it? There's an isser. The isser requires malchus, and once you have malchus, that's it. That's your punishment. You don't have to return it. So Rabbi Yochanan says there's no tshuva. Remember we talked about there's no tshuva for ribis. You get malchus. And so that was the basic machlokes between Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yochanan. The Gemara then went on and discussed various interpretations of that point. So we won't go over all of that, but we're going to pick up from okay. So then we talked about what happens if a person violates the Isser and then he dies. So the question was, do his Yorshim, his estate or inheritors, have to pay it back? So the Gemara concluded that Stamazoi, no, you don't have to pay back. There was no chiyuv on the person who did it. There's no chiyuv on the family. However, if you lend items which have a clear definition, and the Gemara gave us an example of a para, a cow, a talis, or something that isn't just money, but you can identify it, and people will say, "Oh yes, Ruvain treated Shimon very badly, and it was with an item that is clearly identified." So people will remember that. So then the Gemara says that there's a mitzvah of kibbut avayim even after a person dies, and so the Yorshim should return the item because they have to honor their father, even though their other father didn't do right. He lent with interest. So that's how the Gemara we said between chvod avichem, you should have to return it. So therefore, that's where we're really holding right now. And that Gemara is Kvod Avichem. That's about, I don't know. It's if you look in the Gemara, then it is. If you look to the side, you see where it says Hagos Hagra on the side of the Gemara. It's about right there in the middle of the line there, where the Gemara is going to ask a question now. Kvod Avichem Michayve Michayve. Okay, everybody have?
It's right below Pinchas, right?
Yeah, it's a little above Rav Pinchas. Yes, two lines above Rav Pinchas. Rav Pinchas is the beginning of the line, and
Yeah.
two lines up. So this is how we concluded. Now the Gemara is going to ask a kasha. So we're going to ask a kasha. V'hani mikren kvoid avichem mi mechayve? Are are children really mechuyev, even where it's an identified object? Are they mechuyev between kvoid avichem uh, after he dies? Koroi, Khan, we have a pasuk, right? The pasuk says, and in the Torah, it says, "V'nasi ba'amcha lo sa'or," that a nasi, a prince, amongst you, lo sa'or, you shouldn't curse him because it's a terrible, terrible. Since he's a prince in the in the Rosh Hashanah's army or an army or something, you shouldn't curse him. When shouldn't you curse him? Ba'oiseh maseh amcha. When he when he does what is proper among the people. In other words, he does Torah, mitzvahs, all the things that you're commanded to do. Then you have an obligation to give him covet. But if he doesn't do, in other words, he goes astray. He's not a proper representative of the people. Then we infer from that that there is no obligation to honor him. So the Gemara is asking Akasha, the whole point of Kibbud Av, especially Kibbud Av, and the aim after Misa, is because he was a righteous person, and therefore you have to honor him. But if the pasuk tells us that you don't have to honor a prince of Hashem if he doesn't do right, then why are the Yorshim obligated to honor his memory when he himself he took ribbis and okay, he took ribbis and never returned it, but he just took ribbis. And depending on Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lezer, that's a very important avera. So why should the child be mechayev in kibbud av even when it's an identified object? That's what the Gemara is troubled with. We want to make a chilik between money and some object so that the object is remembered. So people say, "Oh, he was a lender in ribbis and all this other." What difference? He didn't do right. If he didn't do right, then the Inyan of kibbud av shouldn't pass to the children. So that's the kasha. That's the kasha of the Gemara.
But just on that issue, kibbud av is still in effect for other things.
For other things, yes. In other words, in this particular event, they don't have to repair what the father did. But you're right. In other things, there still is the mitzvah of kibbud av. But in this particular case, they're going to denigrate their father because people will say kind of terrible things. He was that he lent with ribbis. He was a ganef, whatever they're going to say.
So there's never a case where kibbud av aim goes away because of the behavior of the deceased father.
Well, we know. Look, we know even in life, if a father directs child to do something that is usher, that you don't have to listen to him. So the question is, I mean, that's already violating kibbud av because kibbud av, in its strictest sense, is you have to literally be at the feet of your father.
No, what I was so that's another single item, but in general, the commandment to honor your parents after they, die. There's never a blanket. You should never honor anything about your father. The kibbud always stays there. It sounds like,
Yes,
except
where there's an exception, right?
They're like spikes in the kibbud of the aim.
Correct.
Otherwise, the floor is always
there. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. In other words, the presumption is you're chayiv and kibbud av, and if there's an exception, then like the Gemara is saying here, this case shouldn't be. But
right.
But absent this, there would be kibbud av, right? So that's one of the few mitzvahs. In fact, it's almost the only mitzvah that the neshama of a departed person gets as a chus in Shemayim. The Chazal tell us is on the mitzvah of well, actually, it's limud Torah. Limud Torah is what they talk about. It that if you learn l'shem shemayim, then the neshama gets its chus. But that's all part of the same thing. I mean, if you how else do you do kibbutz av when a parent isn't alive? I mean, you learn Torah lishma, you do all the things in the memory, which is why especially in our circles, but the Jewish people generally want to honor the memory of parents or of grandparents or whoever it happens to be, because when you dedicate something or you learn in their memory, which is what we do on a yard site, you're perpetuating their memory before the Kisei HaKavod, and that's a mitzvah. So
Right.
we're particularly we're makbid, we're particular about on a yard site, lighting a candle, learning,
They
doing.
also
Yeah,
have a there used to be a minhag that even people who were not from in any way, they would always go to the cemetery before Rosh Hashanah.
right. There is that feeling of
Yeah.
righteousness, even in people who aren't really to the core from people.
Right.
And again, that's who we are as Jews. We talked about it at the very beginning, whether it's reform and once a year, or people come on Shabbos and people come every day to daven 3 times a day. I mean, these are all things that are part of who we are. And the truth is, if a person is really dedicated, then people would say, ah, he must have been raised in a home that was righteous, right? Of course, you can be about tshuva, but for the most part, when you see someone doing really good, you immediately think about his parents. Oh, they raised him right. It's wonderful people. So that there's an interconnection that can't be severed. On the
Right.
other hand, if chas v'shalom a person doesn't do right, it's not always the parent, of course, but sometimes the parents get the blame. So again, that's our commandment to do right, so that our parents, our ancestors and our parents should be remembered in a good name. But here,
Rabbi, I'm struggling with what the Gemara just said.
yeah,
Because you said, if I understood correctly, that um, children, if a father, for example, had loaned with ribis, that the children should not rectify that because it would be perceived that they would be dishonoring their father. But I mean, to do what's right, and maybe it was a blind spot. Maybe he intended to do it. Maybe he forgot to reimburse the person who he had ribis. As you said, there's a moral responsibility. So why don't the heirs, the children of the father, have a responsibility to go and rectify that? And that is kibbud avayim, because you're taking it to the next level of rectifying a wrong. So how do you reconcile?
so this really goes to the core of the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yochanan. You're right. According to Rabbi Yochanan, there is no moral obligation, because the minute you do it, and we're going to see in the Gemara today, when that even starts, you'd be surprised how the Gemara is going to define when the issue of ribis begins. But once you engage in ribis, you automatically get malchus, and when you get malchus, the flip side of that coin is you don't have to return it. The mitzvah of returning, of Shabbos Haveda, or returning an item, is a mitzvah. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, that mitzvah is already, it gets canceled out, because you are already over a lav which can't be rectified. So to your point, according to Rabbi Eliezer, yes, of course, you can go to Besdin, or you can demand that it should be repaid, notwithstanding. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, that's where the machlokes comes out. According to Rabbi Yochanan, there is no such thing as repaying. Once you did a deed, you can't repay. And he compares it obviously to the cardinal sins. Let's say shvichas damim, you kill somebody. How are you going to repair that? Bring them back to life? I mean, what are you going to do? So he elevates the issue of ribis to that level where you have stolen from somebody and created poverty, or you created such pain that you can no longer do tshuva. That's an amazing thing that Rabbi Yochanan says. Again, the halacha is not like that, but
But
that's
in
an
situ-
amazing
but
thing.
in
So
the
to your
case of
point, Yes, a person should have a moral obligation, but that moral obligation gets wiped out when, according to Rabbi Yochanan, not according to Rabbi Eliezer, but according to Rabbi Yochanan, now on the question of kibbud av, so yeah, okay, if he wants to return it, lifnim mishuras hadin, that's a wonderful thing. But does he have an obligation to return it? Let's say it's a very expensive item, or or the money was a very large amount of money. So he says, listen, there's already an isser, and the pasuk says that you have to honor when a parent only when the parent does right and the parent didn't do right, so I don't have to honor, I don't have to repay. It's a tough thing to really digest, but that's really the point, Michael.
But Rabbi, if he didn't get lashes and he committed ribis and then so he wasn't punished in this world. And I understand that that this interpretation is once he has committed that, there's no taking it back. And I understand that Rabbi Yochanan is equating this with, shvichat
Yeah,
dam, which is, if it's, it's adjudicated, it's capital punishment. So that's um,
yeah,
uh, retribution for, for the sin in this world. But there's no chance. Why wouldn't heirs? I mean, the implication was okay, so there's no obligation, but the true so you're the belief is that if the children did that, let's say they weren't obligated, but they did that on their own, that would not be an elevation of the neshama. It would be, it's too late to do anything. That's it.
right. Right. So, following that principle, there would be no sort of mitzvah of kibbud av if you did it because the mitzvah doesn't apply. Now, could you say, I want to do the mitzvah anyway? I mean, no one's going to stop you. But in the normal course of events, if you would say, oh, I really want to repair a wrong, there's no, and he brings it down from a pasuk. If you have a nasi who doesn't behave himself properly, even the Torah says you have to listen to the nasi, then there seems to be an exemption of listening to the nasi because he's not worthy. I mean, and that's an also pointed, through the Rabban Shalom. So by kibbud av, it's the same thing he wants to say is that if the parent does right, you certainly have an obligation to perpetuate his memory. But if a parent, in this particular case, does ribis, and ribis, we're not talking about other averas, we're talking about ribis. So in the case of ribis, you are exempt and you do not have to, and it's from the pasuk that you don't have to do it. Now we're going to see from the Gemara in a minute that it's still very much dependent on the machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yochanan. But at this point in time, since we learn it from a pasuk, we say that there is no obligation to honor the parent. So this is the kasha. The kasha is that we said that you have an obligation with an item that's defined to return because of kavod avihem. That's what we said before. Why is that the case? We see from a pasuk that when you have something that is really wrong, you don't. So this is the kasha that the Gemara is asking. So says the Gemara, here's the issue. Could Amar Pinchas Mishmei Rava, Rav Pinchas Mishmei Rava dealt with this question of what do I do? And the Gemara says, so here, in order to understand it, also tshuva. No, that you're right. In an objective sense, he doesn't have to be mechayev. But when the Gemara says that you honor, it's when he did tshuva. So now this begs the question that we spoke about last week. According to Rabbi Yochanan, there is no tshuva. So this in Rabbi Eliezer, you can do tshuva because notwithstanding the avera. So then you do tshuva and you have to honor. According to Rabbi Yochanan, you've already gone beyond doing tshuva. So the Gemara says, also tshuva. So he did tshuva, and therefore, when the Gemara says you have to honor, it's because of tshuva. So keep in mind, if he hadn't done tshuva, there would not have been an obligation to honor, right? Just like the pasuk in the Torah about a nasi. But where you do tshuva, then you are chiyuv, you're chayiv to do kibbut avei. Frek the Gemara, yasa tshuva, my boy Gabe. If he did tshuva, then why didn't he himself return? In other words, he dies. He did ribbis. He did tshuva. What does that mean? He did tshuva. What, in his heart? But he didn't give it back. If he gave it back, this would not be a discussion. But he didn't give it back. Why is there an obligation on the children to give it back? You're saying because he did tshuva, but if he did tshuva, he should have returned it. So what does the tshuva mean? That's kasha. So Frank the Gemara yasa tshuva, my boy Gabe. Why is it still in his possession? And have an obligation of the children to return it. So the Gemara gives an answer, like we always say, we find a tshuva, an answer. He did tshuva, he wanted to return it, and before he returned it, he died. So, in other words, he never had the chance. So, if he would have had the chance and didn't do it, fine. Then there's no kibbut avim. But if he knowingly did tshuva, and then he died before he could fulfill the return of the item, then there's an obligation on the heirs, on the children, to honor the parent because they already were on the path to tshuva, even if they weren't able to complete the tshuva. So that's how the Gemara wants to patch it up and say it's not a stira. It depends on where he was in that point of time. Okay, so we've sort of reconciled that issue. But again, now the Gemara is going to continue to show, or wants to show, that there are problems with supporting Rabbi Yochanan's view that you can't do anything. There's malchus, therefore you don't have to return it. Frek the Gemara Meisvei. So here's the kasha. There's a brisa that says Hagazlonim umalve ribis, gazlonim. Okay, and people who lend with ribis, afa pi shagavu machzirin. That even though they committed the act, they have to return it. So this is a complete steer on Rabbi Yochanan. The Brisa says it. So what is Rabbi Yochanan telling us? That once you have stolen it, you no longer, or once you give ribis, that there's no turning back. The Brisa says beferish, doesn't make any equivocation. It says agazlanu malva beribis. They have to return it. So this is the Gemara is now going to want to drill down on Rabbi Yochanan and try to understand Rabbi Yochanan's theory. Rabbi Lezer is pretty easy to understand. If it's ribis katsutza, then there's no question. Otherwise, the whole system breaks down. So he says, yes, you can go to Bezdin. Bezdin can adjudicate. Avak ribis not. We can justify that to some degree. One is ribis deraisa, one is ribis derabanan. Okay, so Bezdin can do that. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, blanket, even what seems to be a outstanding ribis, you don't have to return. The brisa, there's a brisa that says that farish that you have to return it. All right, so first we have to understand what does the brisa mean. Okay, it lumps together. Remember, we had a couple of weeks ago the Gemara had a kasha. Why do
they're trying to compare when something is stolen as equivalent to ribis for a normal transaction?
Right. So you may or you may not have been here, Jay, when we went a couple of weeks ago, but the Gemara asks, there are three categories which seem to be overlapping. That is gezela, ribis, and oinoah. We learned about ono. So the Gemara asks, why do you need a separate pasuk by all of them? They all seem to stem from the fact that you took something improperly from somebody else.
Right.
So the Gemara goes back and forth. I need the pasuk here. I need the pasuk there. Again, that's a different subject. But you see that they throw them together because what's the common denominator? I took something from you. Ribis, oinoah, gezela. These are all things that I converted something that was yours. So l'chayra, they should all, they're on that same plane.
Right.
Of having taken it. So now the Gemara, so this price, it doesn't talk about a no, it just says Hagazlanim a milve beribis, afa pisha gavu, even though they took it, machzirin. So now Okay, so that they have to return it. So what does it mean? Okay, so we're going to try to show Akasha and Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara first wants to explain what the brisa means. Says the Gemara, Gazlonim, my afapi shegavu ika. um, so by Gazlonim, when you take it, there's an Avera. This is what I said before. We're now going to get very, very precise about when an Isser happens. When are you chayiv on the Gezela? When are you chayiv on the Ribbis? That becomes a very important question. Maybe we don't think about it, but it becomes a very important question. My afal pisha gavu ika. What does the pasuk, the Brisa say? Afal pisha gavu, even though they took it, machzirin. So the Gemara now is going to want to ask, "My afal pisha gavu ika." What does it mean that even though they took it, right? So therefore, because of that, what about if he didn't take it? In other words, the Gemara, it's superfluous. My afal pisha gavu, even though he was gavu, what does that mean? Ma afal pisha gavu, and if he wasn't gavu, and if he didn't take it. Says the Gemara, "I gazel gazel, Eloi gazel loy gazel." In other words, you want to make a chilik in gezela because you're going to say,
Hello.
right? Afal pisha gavu,
Speaking.
even though he collected it, he
Hi.
has to return it.
Okay. Just a minute. Let's see.
Are you with us?
Jonathan, you're
Yeah, I have a phone call. I'm going to
yeah,
mute.
so mute. Why don't you mute?
Right. I'm trying.
So in other words, the kasha here is if the Bryce is going to use that terminology, even though he collected, he has to return, which means that if he didn't collect, does he have to return? What does that mean? He didn't collect. If he didn't collect, he didn't steal. So inherent in the brisa, there's a problem because by using the term afal pi, it means that if he didn't steal, frek the Gemara, he gazel gazel, he lo gazel lo gazel. What was it? Did he steal? Did he not steal? If he didn't steal, there's nothing to return. What does the brisa mean? Right? So on the words of the brisa, we have a kasha.
So when you start comparing that to Ribbis,
We're going to get to the ribbis in a minute because it's going to be the same kasha on ribbis. So we're going to have to understand when does ribbis start,
yeah,
right? Because when does Gezela start? When does ribbis start? So to the point of Gezela, the Gemara says, Ella Ema. So let's clarify what the brisa means. My new malva ribbis, gazlonim, my nihu malva ribbis. So now the Gemara is going to say when the brisa said Gazlanim umalva beribis, it was one and the same. Who is a Gazlan? Someone who's malva beribis. So in other words, the Gemara wants to explain that brisa and say you're absolutely right. If we looked at them as separate items, a Gazlan is a Gazlan, a malva beribis is a malva beribis. What does it mean by a Gazlan that he collected? If he didn't collect, then he's not a Gazlan. So now the Gemara has to back up and understand the brisa. And remember, the Gemara, Talmud as a whole, is a discussion between the Tanoim on their time and the Gemara and the Marorim later, how they interpret it. But it's a guide for us, but not everything is totally clear. So when we see a Machlokes Amarorim or a brisa or this or that, it's not always very clear to us what they mean. And this is an example. What did they mean when they said, "Afal pi shegavu machzirin"? That begs the question, if you didn't steal, how can you be over? So we have to, yeah.
I'm sorry. Don't you have an issue with the intention and how far his thinking has gone? When somebody's a Goslin, he's thought about it ahead of time and he's arranged to not to get caught. So there's a process of preparing for stealing. When it comes to the regular ribbis, I don't know if there's the same.
No, there is a process because remember, we're talking about ribbis ketzutza, where you and I entered a transaction beforehand, and
Right.
it wasn't accidental. I said, you've got to pay me 10% more of what I lent you.
So
It's the same intentional approach as one who goes out to steal and says, I'm going to steal this object. Not accidentally. I'm going to steal
he
it. So,
prepares. So
so they're
both
one and the
sides
same. They're
both
one and the
sides
same.
have preparation.
There was
The one
preparation.
ribis, he's thinking ahead how much ribis I'm going to charge.
That's right.
And the Goslin says, how am I going to do this without getting caught?
In either case,
Yeah,
there is what we call malice aforethought.
right, right,
There is a kavana, not it's not even in our secular common law. There's a difference about premeditated or whether it was the spur of the moment. We call it,
right, right,
whatever. There's different ways of interpreting it. So if someone does something without malice aforethought, it was a total. The people judging or the judge or the jury would look at it differently if it was, oh, there was an opportunity, he took the opportunity. But he wouldn't go out and intentionally steal, but it was there in front of him, so he took it. So that's it's not the same. So the Gemara wants to understand a brisa that has this language that says "Afa b'shegava machzirin." What does it mean? He stole it or he didn't steal it. So the Gemara now wants to invent, I don't mean that in a negative way, wants to interpret that brisa by saying as follows: "My neo malva beribis." Who is a so the Gemara says Gazlonim, it says Gazlonim a Malva Baribis. Says the Gemara, they are one and the same. A Gazlan is a Malva Baribis, right? In other words, we're not talking about Stama Gazlan, someone who goes out and robs somebody. This particular brisa equates and says, who is a Gazlan? Someone who's Malva Baribis. Afa Pisha Gavu Machzirin. So even though he took it, so from this brisa, he has to return it. So this is a kasha and Rabbi Yochanan. Again, the Gemara wants to understand how does Rabbi Yochanan come along and say this, and says there's a brisa which is a steer on Rabbi Yochanan. So how can Rabbi Yochanan come later and say this is my view? There's a beferish brisa that says you can't. What's the brisa? The brisa says alpha bisha gava machzirin, and now we're saying that a gazlan is a malva beribis, and he has to return it. The brisa is saying you have to return it. So how can you, Rabbi Yochanan, come along and say don't have to return it? You already got malchus. There's no mitzvah to return it. The
Rabbi,
brisa beferish says that a gazlan, i.e., malva beribis, has to return. So that's the kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. How can Rabbi Yochanan say that?
Rabbi, I'm struggling with so if it's ribis,
Yeah,
you're telling the borrower, I mean it's in your face. You want money from me, you're gonna have to pay a 10% premium.
right.
So I'm letting you know you have the option not. Is the is a gos the definition of a goslin where you tell a person that you're going to take from them and then you take from them? Is that because to me that's different than what I would think of guzzle? Because ribis, the guy has the option to say, "Well, I can't get your money," and I know it's against the Torah. It's a you know it's an avera, a significant avera, but the person can walk away from it. And I thought Gazelle was with not knowing, or as opposed to thievery with armed thievery. So it's different in that sense that you have the option and you can say no, but you may be so desperate that you have to, and that's an in your face, I'm violating the Torah. But how is that? Can you contrast or compare that for me?
Well, so let me define it. A goslin, in its totally objective sense, is a person who goes out and takes from somebody else. In this case, barabim, but he takes from somebody else, gives the guy no choice. He just takes it. We know what a goslin is.
But with his knowledge, with the person's knowledge, or without the person's
No, with the person's knowledge. There's no surreptitious taking.
knowledge. Okay.
It's a
So in
very
both cases, it's with their knowledge.
correct.
Okay, that's what I didn't understand.
Right. So in this particular case, the Bryce is saying that a Goslin and a Malva Baribis it looks like they're two separate things. There's a Goslin out there who does his thing. There's a Malva Baribas who does his thing, right? And we have this kasha because of the language afapi shagavu machziri. The Gemara wants to now answer, and to your point, Michael, it's not answering the question about a Goslin at large who goes out and steals from somebody else. That's still a Goslin. All right. In other words, we haven't put Goslin in a box and said a Goslin means Malva Baribas. A Goslin is a Goslin. But when the Brisa says Goslin Malva Baribas and lumps it together, it wants to say that that someone who steals, the Brisa wants to tell us that someone who steals, i.e., commits ribis, right? In the context of the Brisa, not in the general sense of a Goslin out there who does his thing. A Goslin is a Goslin, and the Torah says has halachas on a Goslin. Here, Goslin is interpreted to mean Malva Baribas. So the term Goslin isn't the classic Goslin, Michael, that you would think of out there. So in this particular case, if you have a Malva Baribas who's a Goslin, and yet the Brisa says you have to return it, you must return it, i.e., the Malva Baribas has to return it. That's a stira on Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan tells us very clearly you don't have to return it because there's Malchus. That's not what the Brisa says. And the Brisa, it has to be honored because the Brisa comes before Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan can't come and change the Brisa. So we interpret the Brisa now to mean that the word Goslin is Malva Baribas, but there's still a Goslin out there, Michael. There still is someone who's a Goslin. So in this particular case, we say it's a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. How does Rabbi Yochanan reconcile the Brisa? Says the Gemara, Tanohihi. So again, we have a trap door that we can sort of get out of. What's the trap door? That even though the Brisa says that you have to return it, and we're saying that a Goslin is a Malva Baribas, which is a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan, says the Brisa Tanoi that this isn't clear cut. There is a machloikis Tanoim. There's a machloikis Tanoim on this point. What's the machloikis? The Tanya we learned in the Brisa of Nehemiah of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Potun es hal Malva v'esal Orev mipnei sheyesh b'hem kumasei. So you have to follow this logic. The three people, okay, we know it's a Malva and a Lova, but let's say there was a loan with an Orev. An Orev is a guarantor. So there's two types of guarantors, by the way, the Gemara is going to talk about. There's a regular guarantor where someone says, Reuven, lend this to Shimon, and I will make sure you get paid if Shimon can't pay you back. That's called an Orev, a guarantor, right? And we use the term Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelozeh. We are all guarantors for each other in Klal Yisrael. Okay, so what does Rabbi Nechemia say? That so in the case of a ribis, there are three people who commit a sin: the malveh, the loveh, which of course we said last week. That's novel because the Lova, like you said before, Michael, Lova could have said, I don't want to take the loan. I'm not taking the loan. Now you're saying he has circumstances where he has no choice, but there always is a choice. So the Gemara is going to say, because he has a choice and he committed ribis by taking it, he too is mechayiv under the lav. And the Orev is also mechayiv because he's the intermediary and he committed to pay the loan if the Lova wouldn't have paid. So we have three people who are in the crosshairs about ribis.
But Rabbi, why is the guarantor? All he's doing, granted, it's against the Torah, but all he's doing is saying, if he's not going to pay, I'm going to pay, and he's going to pay him more than the loan amount if it's a guarantee.
Oh, yeah. He only guarantees
yeah, but Michael, you just said it. So if he makes that guarantee, then he's like the Lova. He's the borrower. If he makes the commitment, I'm going to pay if the Lova doesn't pay, then you can substitute him for the Lova. If the Lova can't pay, he'll pay. But he knows in advance he's going to have to pay, which means he's over a lav of ribis.
But he doesn't know of ribis ahead of time.
No, he knows the deal. He knows that Reuven.
Oh, he knows about the 10% markup in your example.
Oh, yes. The guarantor was part of the original contract.
I'd say it's sort of like with lashon hara that, and a different concept, but maybe that he's an enabler. Okay,
Right.
so the person who tells lashon
You're
hara,
very good point, because the Malva might not have lent to the Lova if there wasn't an
exactly, that's
Arif.
the whole point of a guarantor, and so it's sort of like lashon hara. The person who tells lashon hara, of course, he's guilty, but why is the person who hears the lashon hara? He's just an innocent bystander.
Because he's
No,
enabling.
without him, it wouldn't mean anything. Guy'd be talking into a
So,
box
so,
with
so
nobody
that,
to
so
hear
that,
it. It wouldn't matter.
right. So people, to your point, people who are medactic, when a person starts talking, you said, but you're going to talk about something, it's lashon hara. I don't want to hear it. Right. There are people right away who said,
Right,
I don't want to hear what you have to say.
right.
But okay, sometimes you hear without realizing you're hearing. That's another thing. But to the point of an Arev knows in advance that there is ribis, and by stepping in to agree to be the Arev, he's really substituting himself for the borrower. Now he may not wind up having to pay if the borrower pays, but you see that ribis is so extreme that anybody who's touched in the process of the ribis is chayiv.
But
So the
Rabbi,
Gemara would,
Rabbi, if
But
he
the
didn't know the
guarantor never
terms and
gets
just
the
guaranteed,
guarantor if he never has to put up the money because the one he helped paid it back. He's
he's still
chayiv in
chayiv. He's still
ribis, even
chayiv.
though
Yeah,
how can he be chayiv in ribis? He never did
because he
anything.
allowed the transaction
He's
to
an
happen.
enabler, not just allowed it. He enabled it. It
He
wouldn't
enabled
have
it.
happened
Right.
if the lender didn't see the guarantor. He would have never made the deal.
but
That's right.
Rabbi, if he guaranteed without seeing the terms, then he would not be over
Well,
the.
if he guaranteed a loan and didn't know there was a ribis, that's a whole different story. But here we're talking about where everybody sat down
Yeah.
and Reuben lent to Shimon and Levi said, I'll guarantee the loan. Shimon was his cousin or something. He said, I'm going to guarantee the loan. So he knew right away that that loan was in play and there was ribis, right? So what does that brisa say? So it's a machlokes tanoim, right? So according to Rabbi Nechemia and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, um, a person a person who is involved in the deal, then
So the guarantor's Averis starts at the time of the conversation.
right. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov and Rabbi Nechemia say that there is an opportunity for the malve and the orev not to be chayiv in ribis. How?
Backs up.
Yesh bohem kum asay. Okay, so what does a kum asay? So in the technical term, we use the term kum asay, shev al taseh. Kum asay means get up and do something. Kum asay. What does it mean here? Because there is a kum asay. Frank, the Gemara, my kum asay. Right, that's a term, and that's a term of art that we use that a person can get up and do something. Let's say positive, do a mitzvah,
So
right?
the guarantor could say, I'm gonna lend you the money to the lova at without the 10%, and he could that's eradicating the Avera. So he could do a straight loan transaction.
Yeah, no, he could do that, but
He
they all
was
sat down
caught.
around the table and they said, we're going to make a transaction here. The transaction is I'm lending you $100 to the Love. And he said, but the condition is that I know you're poor. I know you might not be able to pay it. I need someone who's going to stand and say, I will pay. I mean, that happens all the time in business, is that you're dealing with someone and you're unsure whether the person can provide or come through. So you say to the third person, whatever his connection is to the Love, you're the guarantor. I mean, that's very
But
common.
you can eliminate. My point was on Kumase. You can eliminate the problem of ribis by the guarantor taking over and changing the transaction to say, since he's going to have to pay if he doesn't pay anyway, I'll take over the transaction, but I'm not going to charge you the 10% markup. So you'll pay
So
me.
the
And
lender will
That would
say
be
no
great if
deal.
he's willing to do it.
The
But that's a
lender
different
says no
deal.
deal.
No. What he's saying there is that then you'd have a new lender. The guarantor
yes,
will become the
exactly.
lender.
Right.
But the guarantor
So
may not want to do that. The guarantor may say, you know what, I'll pull out a savings if I need to cover this because this is my relative. I'll help him, but I'm not. I'd rather use that money for other stuff. And 6 months from now, when this is due, I'll deal with it then if I have to. But here's the other interesting twist. What if the guarantor said, you know what? I'll guarantee the $1,000 base value of the loan, but I will not guarantee the ribis
Ribis.
because ribis, I shouldn't be paying that. Nobody should be paying that. So I'll guarantee that. On the other, now the lender might turn around and say, okay, so if the borrower can't pay back everything, I'll get the ribis from him and I'll get the base amount from the guarantor, and I'll be made whole, including
The
ribis.
Malva's not going to do that because he wants the 10%. It's an illegal transaction.
Yeah,
That's
right. So, Menashe, to your point, that's interesting. If that is the case, then the Orev is not really part of the whole transaction.
Right.
Since I'm part of the transaction to the extent of the loan, but I'm not agreeing to ribis.
Right.
So remember I said there's a question, when does ribis actually happen?
Right.
There's a kasha whether it happens in the transaction or in the repayment. In other words, if you and I say we're going to have this deal, are you automatically chayiv and ribis because we entered into a deal? Or is the ribis only when I complete the transaction and I pay you? So,
Pay the ribis.
Nash, in your case, if the Orev says no deal, I'll guarantee you only money that you lend, and then you say okay, and the Malva says okay, and then I'll collect from the Lova. So the Malva has nothing to do with ribis.
But I
I
disagree
mean
with
the
that, Rabbi.
Orev.
I
The
think
Orev.
it does have something to do with ribis because that means that the borrower only has to pay back the 10%. And that makes it so that it's encouraging.
Right. So that's actually why I phrased it that way. Exactly. Which is, on the one hand, you could say, in my case, it could say that the guarantor is free from any issue of ribis because he disavowed it and he's not going to pay it. Or you could say, you know what? He's betting on, yes, he said that, but the lender is still counting on, even if unless the borrower goes totally bankrupt, loses everything, I'll probably still be able to get my ribis, in which case the guarantor is still enabling the ribis.
Right. So we are now discussing what the Gemara will talk about shortly about when does ribis kick in. You're right, Menashe. If ribis kicks in at the outset and the Orev is part of a deal that, quote, has ribis attached to it, even though he is not going to pay the ribis, then l'chayra he should be chayiv because he enabled a transaction that was ribis. Even though he wasn't going to pay the ribis, he enabled a transaction that was ribis, and that's
Right.
also. If you say ribis starts at the moment of the transaction, but if you say it doesn't start at the moment of the transaction, then he never was chayiv in ribis because he never paid ribis. The ribis would only be the malvin lova. But that's getting a little ahead of ourselves as far as getting to that question. We will get to that question. Here, the Brisa says, to answer the kasha, it's a stira, it's a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. So he says, no, it's a machlokes tanoim. What is the machlokes? One Tana says that you're chayiv, that you have to return it and you don't get malchus. Why don't you get malchus? Mishay, because there's a kumasei. Frankly, my kumasei. So what's the answer? Lav mishum demrina luhu kumo ahadoro. So doesn't the kumasei mean that you have an option? You can return the money. So if kumasei means returning the money, then we see clearly that returning the money, according to one Tana, obviates the malchus. Miklal, the Tana Kama,
Who returns the lover returns the money right away and the transaction never becomes a loan? I'm missing something.
Okay. So let's back up a minute. We're saying that according to one Tana, you can save yourself from malchus by returning it. How do you return it? Because the Torah says that in other words, you have an answer to the ribis by returning it. Just simply returning it. In other words, the Malva took ribis, and then he said, oh, I did wrong, and returned it to the Lova. right? He returned it.
Oh, so the Malver is returning
The Malva returned it to the
and the
loan.
Ribbis. Okay.
Right.
Oh, wait a minute, Rabbi. That's when you say he returns it right away, it's
After taking it
after taking the loan.
and being paid ribbis by the lover, he was paid ribbis. So now he has a chiyuv of
Now, if he
malchus.
gives it back, but still, this goes back to the original point. If the agreement was constructed with ribis involved, it's a functional question. Is that when ribis exists? So he shouldn't be able to eradicate that because the deal was constructed.
Okay, so here's the problem. We're dealing with an issue that we're trying to resolve, and once we resolve it, then we're going to get to the problem you're raising, Michael. That's the next problem. If Ribbis starts from the moment that he takes it, then he's already chayiv in Ribbis. So how does he return it? If Ribbis happens when he pays it, that's the start of Ribbis, and he immediately, according to Rabbi Eliezer now, and he immediately turns around and repays it. Okay, he repaid it. I, Rabbi Eliezer, say no malchus because I repaid it. But if you're going to say Ribbis starts at the beginning when they even discussed it, then Ribbis is already off the table. He's already chayiv in Ribbis. But what I'm trying to say, Michael, is that's a discussion we're going to get into in detail after this discussion.
Okay, but I want to understand this situation. So the Malva lends him, let's say it's $1,000 and I want $100 premium.
Right.
The Malva lends him $1,000. So he's got to wait until he's paid back.
Right.
And he pays him back 1,100.
Right.
In your example that we're talking about.
Right.
And then the Malva pays him back the 100, saying that I shouldn't have taken.
I did an error. Right.
And that's the case we're talking about.
Right. And according to Rabbi Eliezer, you don't get malchus because you returned it. That's Rabbi Elezer's view. Right. Remember, we're trying to answer a kasha, a stira on Rabbi Yochanan, because from the previous Gemara, from the Brisa, we see that that afa pisha gavu machzirin, and we say that he still so you can return it. So what did Rabbi Yochanan say? You can't return it. So we say no. It's a machlokes of Tanoim, and Rabbi Yochanan holds like one Tana, and Rabbi Eliezer holds like another Tana. So our case that we're now talking about, that we say kum asay, this is the Tana who Rabbi Eliezer holds like. What does it mean? It means that if I lent in Ribbis and I return it, I'm absolved from Malchus because I did a kum va'aseh.
But we said before, and I'm sure we're going to get into this in more depth next week, but we said before that Ribbis you can't undo once Ribbis is done. So the question of when Ribbis occurs, and so if the agreement is there and the guy paid him back Ribbis, and then it's already done. The action of returning that money with a premium.
He paid $100 at the transaction.
Say it's at the agreement stage.
Yeah.
So it's too late by that time.
According to Rabbi Yochanan. According to Rabbi Yochanan.
I'm lost here because it sounds like they're having this transaction. They're sitting down and they agree to $1,100 to be paid back for a $1,000 loan.
Right.
And at that meeting, somebody pulls out $100 and says, "Look, I'm paying the Ribbis right up front, so there shouldn't be any Ribbis."
After the deal is so,
I'm missing something.
So the first point we haven't gotten to yet, if I can explain it and then correct me, Rabbi and Menashe.
Yeah.
So the first point is it at the point of the deal? We haven't gotten an answer to that yet because we don't know when Ribbis first occurs. But in their argument now is a situation where the deal was struck and the return was made. And the payment was made, and then he returns it. And before he returns it before anything else happens. Can he do that? And will that undo Ribbis at that point?
Hold on. And Rabbi Eliezer says yes, and Rabbi Yochanan says no. That's the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yochanan.
So
Rabbi
in one
Yochanan
view, they're trying to cancel the ribbis by paying it up front right away. Somebody,
has
No,
nothing to do
this
with
is after it's all consummated.
Jay has nothing to do with paying it up front, not paying up front. Remember, again, we're getting ahead of the issue of when ribis applies. So I don't want to get into that discussion right now.
But
Ribis is
Rabbi,
ribis.
isn't that I'm not going to ask you to go down that road, but isn't that the crux of this issue? How can we potskin without knowing when that
Okay,
actually is?
so but you have to remember is that the Gemara this is a timeline. So we started out by saying this machlokes Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yochanan, and we wanted to give Zaraya, and then we asked Akasha, how could Rabbi Yochanan says what he says? There's a brisa against him. So now the Gemara wants to say, no, Rabbi Yochanan isn't wrong because there is a Tana that holds like him. That's all we're saying. In other words, we're not talking about what is ribis, when is ribis. We're talking about the fact that we see in a brisa, you can return it without malchus. That's strictly against Rabbi Yochanan's view. Says the Gemara, no, there's another brisa, and there's a machlokes in that brisa. When a person lends, can he return it? So Rabbi Nechemia and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov say, Potrunis ha-malva v'sa-orev, and this begs another question, which I don't want to say right now, but I will tell you, is that the malva and the orev can be exonerated because of what's called kum aseh. Now, let me explain kum aseh in practical terms, which you may have heard of in other learning. There's something called lav hanituk ba'aseh. Maybe you heard of that expression. A lav, a sin, which is repaired with an aseh. It's in the Torah. Lav hanituk ba'aseh. You can undo a lav with an aseh. What does that mean? That means, according to Rabbi Nechemia and Rabbi Eliezer, two Tanoim, that if you do an Aveira, i.e. ribis, that you can exonerate yourself from the Aveira by doing an Aseh. What is the Aseh? The Aseh is returning the money. There is a mitzvah to return the money. So if you have a lav anitik ba'aseh, now you don't have a lav anymore, and therefore there's no malchus. That's what one Tana says. The other Tana, and the Gemara says here, Michlal, the Tana Kama, Sava, Lav B'nei Hadurininu. Because there is a Machlokes Tanoim, and we explain the one Tana, meaning the Rabbi Nechemia and Rabbi Eliezer, so there's another Tana. It doesn't tell us who it is. There's another Tana who doesn't hold like that. That's the Tana that Rabbi Yochanan is hanging his hat on. The Tana who says you can't return it, Rabbi Yochanan says, I hold like that Tana. So in our discussion now, we're getting a little bit ahead of this discussion, but in our discussion now, there was a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. How can he say that? The answer is because he's hanging his hat on a Tana who says the very same thing. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan can say, I hold like that Tana. This is a diversion from what we're going to get to in a minute. So we have a good discussion about something we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But for the purpose of this situation, Rabbi Yochanan isn't wrong because he's hanging his hat on the views of a Tana who says you can't undo. He doesn't hold lav hanitik ba'aseh. He doesn't say that the interpretation of lav hanitik ba'aseh means you can undo the avera, and you can therefore be potter from malchus. That's strictly speaking what this brisa is telling us.
But Rabbi, it has to go back to when does ribis occur, because there obviously have to be two opinions from the Tanakh.
According to Rabbi Yochanan, it doesn't matter when ribis occurs, whether it occurs at the outset or at the repayment.
Right.
Once you conjure together a deal for ribis, that's ribis.
But then if there's a Tana supporting him, then there must be a Tana who believes that, which is from the outset, so that the same machlokus exists as to which goes back to when does ribis occur.
Okay. So
the agreement, so
right.
It's all intertwined. It has to be.
Okay, so I'm not going to dispute what you just said, and I'm going to say, okay, you're right. The Tana who Rabbi Yochanan holds like says ribis is ribis from the moment you engage. Okay, I'm not going to argue that. So, but
But
let's
isn't that what everything's centered on? It seems like we're doing it in reverse. Everything's centered on when ribus occurs, and we're talking about opinions about you can undo it or not. It all has to do with the source. So it seems like we're working backwards.
okay. So let me say this: if you can do tshuva on ribis, why does it matter if ribis happened at the moment of the transaction or at the moment of repayment? If ribis per se can be undone, regardless
But
of
we
when
have a
it happened.
disagreement whether it can be undone. So the question is, when does it occur? So if it can't be undone once it's done, as it was compared to shvichas damim, which you can't undo shvichas damim, so you can't, at the point where it occurred, you can't undo it. At least that's an opinion.
That's the
So it
opinion of
goes
Rabbi Yochanan.
back to that source that when does ribis occur?
Oh, okay. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, it doesn't matter. You're right. According to Rabbi Yochanan, at this point, it doesn't matter if the ribis happened at the
Well, I
outset.
don't agree with that. According to him, it occurs at the point the agreement is entered into, because that's the first point, and it is ribis at that point.
I'm not going to disagree with you. That's correct. That's what from our Gemara, it would seem. Again, I'm not going to argue it. Yes, it would seem that Rabbi Yochanan is of the opinion that ribis happens at the outset, so you already have ribis. Because if it happens later, then and you don't repay, then there was never ribis. You're
But my
right.
point is that it does it to him it does matter when it happens, because you would never get to the point afterward that
Right.
you could undo it. So it has to happen at the point,
Correct.
and
Okay.
that is what they disagree about.
Okay. So yes, I'm going to say the answer is you're right. That if Rabbi Yochanan now again, I don't want to get ahead of what the Gemara is going to discuss, but yes, from our discussion here, it would be clear that Rabbi Yochanan says ribis occurs right away,
It would
and
appear
therefore
that way.
right away, and therefore there is no possibility of return of tshuva, and therefore Rabbi Yochanan holds like that Tana, who says that lav hanitik ba'aseh doesn't. It's not a remedy. In other
It's
words,
too late.
if you can't repair it with an aseh because you already committed the lav. So I'll agree to that. I'll agree to that. So now. Okay, so the Gemara then says, hold on, the Gemara then says, Shma Mina. All right, so we have a machlokes between all right, so in this machlokes between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan, we're saying that each one hangs his hat on a different Tana. Rabbi Elazar holds like the Tana, you can return it, therefore he can justify what he's saying. And Rabbi Yochanan, who's coming along and saying you can never do tshuva, he's not making it up. There's a Tana who says it, right? So, okay, now we're good. That's what we're good. Frek the Gemara right away. We have to complete this. Says the Gemara right away, lo, you've got it all wrong. When you say that the Brisa is saying that you have an obligation to return according to Rebbe Lezer, according to that Tana, because lava nitik be'aseh, we're talking about not where he paid. This is where it gets interesting. Not where he repaid the ribis, but we're talking about he didn't collect the interest yet. We make a deal. I say you're going to pay me $100 of interest, and then before the transaction is completed, right? This is the machlokes in the brisa whether you need completion or not. So we just said Rabbi Yochanan hangs his hat on the Tana, who says that there's no kumva aseh, and you make the point, Michael, that means that ribis happens right away. Otherwise, what does it mean? So this is inherently what now the Gemara says. What do you mean? The Brisa tells us two views, and one is Rabbi Yochanan's view, one is Rabbi Elazar's view. You've got it wrong. Lo, my kum aseh. What does it mean, kum aseh, that you can undo what you did, right? That you can undo what it did. The ribis. So when is ribis? When does it become ribis? When does it actually become ribis? If you haven't collected or taken the ribis, is it really ribis? So my kumasei. Um, so the kasha now is on the Tana, on the Tanoim, Rabbi Nechemi and Rabbi Eliezer and Yaakov, who say that you can do kumasei, that you can return it. Wait a minute. What do you mean you return it? You already chayiv and ribis from the time of the loan. If you're going to say that that's what we're talking about, then we have a problem understanding the Tanoim who say that you can do kum asay, you can return it. What do you mean return it? You never paid it. You never paid the ribis. Ribis started the moment you transacted. You chayiv and ribis. How can you now undo that isser? If what are you going to return? There's nothing to return. So the Gemara's kasha is that how do we understand that brisa? The brisa itself is a problem where it distinguishes between the two tanoim, and so in the Manda Omer of Nechemia and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, how do you even have kum va'aseh? How do you have the possibility of kum aseh if the ribis happened at the outset?
It's too late.
Right?
It should be too late.
Right. So on that point, the Gemara just wants to give an answer. Lekroa shtora. So this is an interesting answer because what does it mean, lekroa shtora? You rip up the contract of ribis. Because remember, this is all documented. So you have a loan, it's documented that there's interest, and now we're going to go weiter. So if you hold that ribis starts at the time of the loan, then we don't understand what it means kumasei to repair it. Says the Gemara, no. The symbol of the ribis was the shtar. The shtar, the loan document, was what the siman of the ribis is. But if you're going to go ahead and rip up the shtar symbolically, you're now going to take that shtar, rip it up, then there was never ribis. In other words,
obligation.
There was never an obligation. Right.
Yeah,
So,
but the question is, did you rip up the shtar after he lent the money or before he lent the money?
after he lent the money. After he lent the money.
So theoretically, then the lovid doesn't have to pay it back.
Right.
Correct.
He pays
right. He'll claim right. When the guy comes to collect the money, he'll say, "What money? Show me a contract."
Right. So what we're saying is that the kum asay is the ripping of the shtar, not the kum asay is that lav hanitik ba'asay that you're going to malva will pay him back. That's what we think kum asay means. I took ribis improperly. I'm paying you back. Here we're saying no. You didn't have to pay him back. You ripped up the shtar. That's the asay. The asay is the ripping of the shtar that you never loaned the money. You just discussed it and you were about to lend it.
But you just said you never loaned the money, which means that it's before the loan was made. The actual
No. It was after the loan was discussed and agreed upon.
Okay, but before the
guarantor is off the hook also.
Right.
Say again?
If you rip up the shtar, the guarantor is off the ribis.
Everybody's off the hook.
Yeah.
Everybody's off the hook.
So that's a do-over. It's undoing the transaction before it came a transaction because
but the malva
the agreement was there. There's still going to be a machlokes that is still ribis. But if no money changed hands, which is what you're talking about right now, before the money, the loan was made, can you undo it and take away
he didn't give him the $1,000 yet.
He didn't give him the $1,000.
Right. So
they have an agreement, and right away we're tearing up the shtar. I'm going to lend you the money without ribis.
So there's still going to be a machlokes between those who say the fact that you created an agreement.
Correct. The machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yochanan will remain. But now we're going to have a problem because you're hanging your hat on a machlokus of Tanoim. There is no machlokus of Tanoim. In other words, the Tana who you think says that you can't undo, you can undo because we're talking about tearing up a document. Remember, we had a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan, and we want to answer the question because Rabbi Yochanan holds like a Tana who says what he says.
But
Now
how
we're
do you-
saying, and let me just finish. Now we're saying that that Tana doesn't say what you think he's
But
saying.
how do we know that?
That's what the Gemara is interpreting. The Gemara is interpreting that brisa means he tore up the shtar. Therefore, there is no machlokas of Tanoim about whether or not you are chayiv for malchus no matter what, because they're saying when you tore up the shtar, there is no ribis.
But is it clear that that Tana was only talking about ripping up
Yes,
the star?
yes, yes.
But the Malvin now has to change his mind and
Oh,
say,
the
I'll
Malva.
take back 1,000, not 1,100.
Yeah, in
So
other
now
words,
we-
he had charata, he had tshuva before he even went into the deal. But the point is, and Michael, I understand the complication, but the point here we want to make is Rabbi Yochanan, he based his position on a Tana. Which Tana? The Tana who argued with Rabbi Nechemia and Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, and said that when it says kumasei, we think a kumasei means you made the loan, and therefore, according to that Tana, you can't undo, and according to these Tanaim, you can undo. Then we see Rabbi Yochanan has a legitimate Tana to hang his hat on.
But
Now,
wouldn't we conclude based on this that if the loan proceeds were given to the Lova, then we have there's no undoing ribis. The other Tanoim may disagree with that, but what's clear is if the funds were actually lent, we have a case of ribis at
Yeah.
this. So now we've changed the definition to be more. It's before any funds change hands. You can rip up the agreement. This is this Tana's interpretation. You can rip up the agreement before, even though you had intent, you can undo the intent by ripping up the agreement before any funds change hands. But if funds changed hands, if the loan was made, regardless of the repayment, you have ribis and that's it.
Right.
The lender has to be the one to rip up the contract.
Yeah, yeah. But okay, so what you said is 100% correct. So what are we left with now, Michael? You just made a good point. What are we left with? We're left with a machloikis between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan without tanoim that they can hang their hat on. The whole point of this discussion was that we're going to absolve Rabbi Yochanan from his very harsh view because there's a Tana who says it.
Yeah,
But
but
Tana,
Tana
wait a
does
minute.
say-
The Tana doesn't say it. The Tana is talking strictly about a loan that never happened. And the question is, are you chayiv? And that Tana agrees that if you tear up the shtar, there is no ribis. That Tana agrees that
But the other Tanoim may not agree that. They may say that even if you made the loan, you can still undo it. Rabbi
right. No, we're going to say that all the Tanoim agree that this brisa, when the brisa says kum asay, that it means ripping up the shtar. So even the Tana who says that you can't undo ribis, the reason why you're undoing ribis is because there was never ribis because you tore the shtar.
So now
Now we're strictly back to the machloikis Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan, and who does Rabbi Yochanan hang his hat on? There's a brisa that says that you can return it. How can he argue on a brisa? So we thought he was hanging his hat on another Tana, and we just disproved that and say, no, that Tana is talking about something totally different. So you, Rabbi Yochanan, are still on an island. Who do you hold like? How can you argue against Tanoim? How can you argue against Tanoim?
Do we know that so we know that the Tana that Rabbi Yochanan felt was supporting him, you said there's evidence that it's ripping up the shtar, but not at the creation of the shtar. So that Tana allows ripping up the shtar before any part of the
That's an exemption to ribis, is that if you rip up the shtar before the loan happens,
so you get a chance to undo it.
So we're going to create a fiction, a legal fiction,
Right.
that ribis never happened
Right.
because there's no star. I think Menashe or someone said, "Oh, let's go back and see this loan." Well, there's nothing to see. There's no star.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
so we are now at the point where we're back to a machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan is on an island. Who does he hold like? He's
Yeah.
an Amora. How does he create new law? The Tanoim don't say what he says. So now you, Rabbi Yochanan, come along and say that there's no tshuva, you get Malchus. Where do you get that from? Where do you get it from? That was the kasha. We thought we had an answer that it was a machlokes tanoim. We just said it's not a machlokes tanoim. We're back to the kasha. So that's where we are now. So again, that's why I said this is an unfolding story, because every time you think you have an answer, there's another kasha. And that's the beauty of learning, is that there's a continuum here. So let's stop here, because obviously we're now going to get into a deeper discussion of whether or not what we just said is fair or not. But at least for our discussion here, and I know that there's a lot of questions about something that happened or didn't happen, where the Tanoim are taking the view that at the outset you can undo an Avera, and that's what Kumase means. The question of whether or not you did the loan with Ribis and whether you undo it, put that aside. Put that aside. That's not our discussion. Our discussion is simply at the outset when you made the Ribis, before you made the loan, before you made the loan, can you undo the Ribis, or are you forever left to Malchus? The Tanoim agree that you can rip it up. If they
Okay.
say you could rip it up, and the Ribis never happened, how does Rabbi Yochanan say that there's Malchus and you can't do tshuva? That's simply the question now. All right.
We have
So
a week to think about it.
you have a week to think about it, right? So Mitzvah Hashem, next week we're gonna proceed, and we're gonna try to further understand whether or not what we just said is legitimate. But keep that in mind. We said something that was very profound, and we accept it. Now the question is that really right?
That's the right one. Yeah.
Is that the right way to interpret it? So
Yeah.
Mitzvah Hashem, next week we'll go from here.